I'm Julia Fisher. Welcome to the Olive Tree. For those who follow this program regularly, you will know that the aim is to bring you stories of believers in Jesus who live in Israel, including the West Bank, to reveal what God is doing there today. You may be asking, why? What has this to do with me? Well, my guest today can answer that question because she's neither Jewish nor lives in Israel. But over the years, she has felt compelled to study the Bible for herself, to find out why God has such a heart and purpose for Israel and her people, wherever they may be living. Today, she is part of the vocal trio called Hebron, featuring Simon Elman, Helen Shapiro, and Chrissy Rogers. Chrissy, welcome to the Olive Tree. Where did it all begin for you?
Well, my early life, as you say, I was born in Pittsburgh. I was born into a very devout religious family, church-going family. But having said that, I had no real knowledge of the Bible. We didn't read the Bible as a family, even though we went to church. And it wasn't until I was 15 years old that I came to a crunch point in my life where I knew that I needed answers and I needed help. And I turned to the Bible for that. And when I did that, I learned just some amazing things. The first two important things that I learned were, number one, that I was a sinner. I didn't think that I was, because I'd led a very moral life up into my teens. But that the Bible explains that being a sinner is not wrongdoing, but wrong being. And when I saw that in the scriptures, I immediately understood it, because the things that were happening in my heart were sinful, even though I didn't commit any of them. But the second and most important thing I learned was that Jesus came and died in order to take the punishment for my sin and my sins. And when I realized that, I committed my life to Jesus. I repented of my sins, asked for his forgiveness, and became born again. Now that started a domino effect through my whole family, leading to 3 generations of my family coming to know the Lord in a personal way and committing all of our lives to him. So,
what sort of age were you then, Chrissy?
I was 15, and I took the Bible and read it secretly. Nobody in my family knew that this was happening in my heart or in my life. On the outside, I looked like a great American teenager. In fact, my goal since I had been 7 years old was to study and perform classical music. I was trained on the French horn. And my early plan was to be the world's most famous French horn player. But by the time I was 15, that all changed. And when I was born again, for the first time, obviously, I began to pray about my future. And this led me to discovering what was happening in America at the time. So we're looking at the early to mid 70s in America. So out of the Summer of Love in 1969, the whole Vietnam War and the rebellion on college campuses. All right. So I was just coming in behind that as a teenager, but seeing it, watching it. And what was happening in America in the early 70s was a revival of Jewish young people coming to know the Lord as Messiah. That started out on the West Coast, where everything seemed to start. And that was spreading across America. So I then found myself meeting these young Jewish teenagers, college students who were having the revelation that Jesus was the Messiah. And they were coming out of the ashrams and the communes and really being set free.
Yeah, many of them were hippies, weren't they, as you say?
That's right, yeah. It was quite an earthquake in America. That's when the Jesus People movement started as well. There was a lot happening spiritually in America, and there was a great need for that.
And so this affected your thinking. Oh, how interesting.
Yes. And as I continued reading the Bible, I was learning that Jesus was Jewish, that his audience were Israelis, and this was just all exploding in my own understanding, as well as in my friends. That led me to join a young, small gospel group. I'll call it a gospel group. It was all made up of Jewish believers in Jesus. And so I left my plans. I prayed about it, but I left my plans to become the world's most famous French horn player. And I went on the road full time with this little singing band. And we toured. I toured with the group for 10 years, all over Europe. We toured Israel. We toured all across America, coast to coast, Canada, Mexico, Central America. I did that for 10 years.
What was the band called, Chrissy?
The very unassuming, ineloquent, and internationally unacclaimed Star of David Singers. That was the name that was chosen. It was out of my hands. But back then, there was also a great awakening in the church about the place of Israel, Israeli prophecy, what was going to happen in the latter days leading up to the Lord's return. So really, in a sort of a vulgar parlance, I was riding the crest of a huge wave back in those days. And that really set the stage for me. The Lord immediately put a call on my life as a teenager to bring the gospel to Jewish people.
Is that when you started to learn Hebrew and Yiddish as you
Yes,
later
that's
did?
right. Well, the Lord put it, it felt like the Lord had his finger in my back to learn Hebrew. Now, I didn't have the means or wherewithal to learn Hebrew back then. I was on the road. I was traveling constantly. Our tours lasted 9 and 10 months out of the year.
Wow.
And we were doing one-nighters. I mean, you couldn't do that today the way we did it. But the Lord led me to, when I was in Chicago at one stage, and I went along to a bookstore that supplied all the synagogues in Chicago, a very Jewish area of Chicago. I went into this bookstore and I asked the man behind the counter, I said, I would like you to sell me the best book to learn Hebrew. And he said, come with me. Now, this was a vast store. He took me down into the basement, and it looked like the National Archives. I mean, there were stacks and stacks and stacks, rows and rows of shelves. And he took me back, and he selected this one paperback book, and he handed it to me, and he said, this is the best book. And I thanked him. I paid for it, and I left. And I got it back to where I was staying, and I opened it, and it was entirely in Hebrew. And I thought, has he just played a big joke on me? You know?
Yeah.
Anyway, long story short, I bought a dictionary later, and I met an Israeli who could teach me the alphabet. But keep in mind, I was traveling all the time. And this was before, way before the internet. This was like 1977. Mm-hmm. You didn't have, I mean, cassette tapes, I think, were just being invented. Maybe it was still 8-track. I can't remember. I bought this dictionary and I learned the alphabet, and there I was on my own. And it took me 7 years to get through this book. Now, it was a brilliantly laid out book. Anybody else with a teacher could have done it in maybe 7 months, but it took me all that time. By the time I finished, I knew enough in my head, but obviously my fluency wasn't there. After 10 years on the road, I took a sabbatical. I went back home. I joined a Hebrew circle in the Jewish community. Now, they were very suspicious of me because I was a Gentile. And a lot of these people, they were Hebrew teachers. They were Holocaust survivors. They really resented my presence until we started to work together. And my Hebrew teacher was an Israeli, and she did believe in me. But long story short, after they accepted me, they used to have a little sort of a tradition that anybody that would come into this circle had to tell about themselves all in Hebrew in order to introduce themselves. And then we would go around the room and introduce ourselves. And one day, this happened. A couple came. They wanted to join this little circle. We went around the room, and every time it became my turn. By this time, my classmates were very proud of me, this Gentile who had taught herself from this book. And came my turn, and there was high anticipation of me telling my story. And I always told how I came to faith in Jesus, that this was the catalyst. And so I told my story, and the visitor said this day, she said, what was the name of that book that you used? And the whole class turned to me because they'd never asked me that. And I gave the name of the book, and she said, "Oh, yeah, that's a famous book. Oh, yeah, my nephew learned from that book. I taught from that book in Israel, And then the visitor said, "Yeah, that's the book that comes with the English handbook." And I said, "What?" And they looked at me, and she said, "You mean he didn't sell you the handbook?" I said, "No." Well, all their needles went up to 10. And the whole Jewish community found out about me because I taught myself from this book without the handbook.
Wow.
So that was a little bit of my journey.
That shows that you've got perseverance, Chrissy, for sure.
Well,
what brought you to the UK?
Well, in my travels during those early days, the 70s and 80s, I came to the UK as part of my touring. And eventually I met quite a few people. David Pawson is a name that people would remember. He was beginning to preach about the fulfillment of prophecy for Israel. I met Tony Pierce, again, very, very prolific in his writings about prophecy fulfillment regarding Israel and Jewish people. I met a lot of people. And one of the organizations I met was Prayer for Israel. And what ended up happening was the Lord led me to apply to work in this country under the auspices of Prayer for Israel. So in 1988, I moved here, and I've been here ever since doing that. I worked for PFI for 12 years. I've also worked with Helen Shapiro for, 20 odd years. Can't remember now. And then eventually, after a bit of a hiatus, the Lord led me to Messianic Testimony, and that's who I work with now.
You've been listening to Chrissy Rogers, and we'll hear more of her fascinating story on next week's programme. The Olive Tree Reconciliation Fund is a Christian charity based in the UK that supports the needs of both Jewish believers and Arab or Palestinian Christians living in Israel and the wider Middle East. If you'd like to know more about our work and receive our free bi-monthly newsletter, please visit our website, olivetreefund.org. Meanwhile, join me at the same time next week for another story from the Olive Tree. Until then, goodbye.